Around 900 AD, one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth went silent. Across dozens of city-states spanning hundreds of miles of jungle, construction stopped, mid-project. Tools were set down, temples were left half-finished, and the ruling class, the astronomers, the mathematicians, the priest-kings who could predict eclipses centuries in advance, vanished. But here's what doesn't fit the textbook story. The common people stayed. They lived on in thatched huts among the ruins for generations. They didn't flee a famine. They didn't lose a war. They lost their leaders. Every single one, from every major city, at roughly the same time. So where are the bodies of the divine kings? If they died of drought or warfare, where are the mass graves? And why did the people left behind spend the next 6 centuries performing increasingly desperate rituals, not mourning the dead, but begging their gods to come back? What if the Maya didn't collapse at all? What if the people who built this civilization simply went home? The mainstream explanations are well documented and worth acknowledging. Prolonged drought, intensified warfare between rival kingdoms, environmental degradation from slash-and-burn agriculture, the breakdown of interregional trade networks, all of these played a role in destabilizing classic Maya society. The evidence for each is real, and no serious investigation dismisses it outright. But none of it explains the pattern. The disappearance was selective. It wasn't entire populations that vanished. It was a specific stratum of society. The Kuhul Ajah, the divine kings, and the priestly elite who maintained the astronomical knowledge, the long count calendar, the complex mathematics. These people evaporated from the historical record as if someone flipped a switch. Meanwhile, commoners continued living in the shadow of pyramids they no longer understood, performing rituals whose original purpose was already fading from memory. Consider what was lost overnight. The long count calendar, one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems ever devised by any civilization on Earth, was simply abandoned. Not gradually simplified, not adapted, abandoned. Why would a people discard a calendar they'd maintained for centuries, unless the only people who understood it were gone? And then there's the waiting. The Chilam Balam texts, prophetic records preserved in secret after the Spanish conquest, reveal that the surviving Maya didn't just grieve, they calculated. They computed return dates tied to specific astronomical cycles. They weren't mourning a dead civilization, they were tracking an orbit. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question for 100 years. Not, why did the Maya collapse? But something far more unsettling. Where did the Maya go? To answer that, we need to examine 4 streams of evidence that have no business converging, but do. Ancient texts that read like engineering manuals. A king's tomb that looks like a cockpit. Biological anomalies in elite remains that defy evolutionary explanation. And a classified CIA document that connects Maya pyramids to the surface of Mars. Let's start with the oldest source we have. The Popol Vuh is commonly called the Bible of the Quiche Maya. But read it closely, as scholars like Dennis Tedlock and iconographer Carl Taube have, and it doesn't sound like scripture. It sounds like a mission report. The supreme being in the Maya creation story is called Huracan, the origin of our word hurricane. But his full title is far more interesting, Heart of Sky. And the Popol Vuh doesn't describe Heart of Sky as a cloud, or a spirit, or a feeling. It describes him with mechanical specificity, a black, reflective disc mounted on his forehead, from which poured rotating columns of fire and smoke. His breath could flatten forests. Now, the Maya had one material that was black, glossy, and reflective, obsidian. So they called the disk an obsidian mirror. But what if obsidian was simply the closest word they had for something they'd never seen before? A cockpit canopy, a heat shield, an optical sensor array. And what about those rotating columns of fire? To a people who had never seen a combustion engine, plasma exhaust from a thrust vectoring nozzle would look exactly like smoking, spinning fire. But the most telling detail in the Popol Vuh isn't the description of the gods. It's how they worked. The creation of humanity wasn't instantaneous. It was iterative. First, the gods made humans from mud, and they dissolved. Then from wood. No consciousness, no intelligence. Failures were destroyed, and the process restarted. Finally, maize. Success. A viable species. That's not divine omnipotence. That's trial and error. That's the signature of scientists running experiments, iterating on failures, adjusting variables. Any genetic engineer today would recognize the process. The Popol Vuh doesn't describe creation by gods. It describes colonization by engineers who came from the sky. But which sky? Hold that thought. Because if the Popol Vuh documents the arrival, the next text documents something far more disturbing. The books of Chilam Balam, the words of the jaguar priest, are among the most haunting documents in Mesoamerican literature. Written in Maya Yucatec using Latin script after the Spanish conquest, they were hidden from colonial authorities and passed down through generations of secret keepers. They contain prophecy, history, and, if you read them without the filter of conventional interpretation, what appears to be an eyewitness account of a catastrophic departure. The Chilam Balam of Tizimin and Chumayel describe an event unlike any natural disaster. The sky collapsed onto the earth. The great serpent was seized. It rained fire. Ash covered the land. The bones and skin of the great serpent fell to earth. Mainstream scholars typically interpret the Great Serpent as a metaphor for celestial phenomena, a constellation shifting position perhaps, or a particularly violent storm season. But the language is physically violent in ways that weather metaphors don't require. Bones falling to earth, skin tearing, the sky itself collapsing. This isn't a poetic description of a drought. This is a description of a massive airborne object breaking apart, debris raining down, structural fragments impacting the ground. And the serpent itself? In Maya culture, the feathered serpent, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, is always depicted the same way: cylindrical, scaled, metallic, capable of flight, and wreathed in fire. A flying, metallic, fire-producing cylinder. The shape is eerily specific. But here's what haunted the Spanish missionaries most when they arrived in the Yucatan centuries later. They expected to find people who feared them. Instead, they found people who had been expecting them. The Maya believed that pale, bearded visitors would return from the east, fulfilling the prophecy of Kukulkan's return. They'd calculated the date, Katun 13 Ahau, a precisely recurring cycle in the long count system. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't passive religious hope. This was a mathematical prediction. They weren't lighting candles and praying for miracles. They were counting days with the precision of mission control tracking an orbital window. The Chilam Balam doesn't mourn a dead civilization. It timestamps a departure and provides a countdown for the return. Ancient texts, of course, can be interpreted 100 different ways. So let's turn to something carved in 5 tons of limestone, something you can touch. In 1952, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz Lullier made the discovery of a lifetime beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque. After 4 years of excavating a rubble-filled staircase, he reached a sealed crypt containing the sarcophagus of Kinich Janab Pakal, one of the greatest Maya kings who ruled for 68 years. The 5-ton carved limestone lid covering his remains has been debated ever since. An archaeologist sees the world tree, the earth monster, and the king's rebirth into the underworld. Fair enough. But an aerospace engineer sees something very different. Pakal is depicted reclined with his knees drawn to his chest, the exact anti-G posture used by astronauts in NASA's Mercury and Gemini capsules to withstand launch acceleration. His hands aren't folded in prayer or resting peacefully. His left hand operates a ridged lever. His right hand manipulates what appears to be a dial or button. His nose is connected to a device that archaeologists label ceremonial jewelry, but which sits in the precise position and shape of an oxygen mask or communication apparatus. Below and behind him, a complex assembly of tubes, box-shaped structures resembling filters, and at the very base, plumes of fire and smoke erupting downward. Officially, these are the roots of the World Tree and the jaws of the Earth monster consuming the king. But the roots have the geometry of exhaust channels. The jaws contain what look like fuel lines and pressure regulators. And at his feet, Pakal's soles press against what resembles a directional control pedal. There's also the psychoduct, a narrow, hollow tube running from Pakal's burial chamber straight up through the pyramid to the temple floor above. The standard explanation is that it allowed the king's soul to escape. The engineering explanation? A ventilation shaft, a signal conduit, or part of a life support system for someone sealed inside in a state of long-term stasis. Here's the honest truth. Both interpretations are structurally defensible, and that itself is remarkable. No other piece of ancient art on Earth so precisely replicates the internal layout of a spacecraft that it can sustain a serious aerospace reading. Either the Maya accidentally invented rocket iconography, or they carved what they saw. But Pakal's tomb raises a deeper question. Who exactly were these rulers? Because when we examine their biology, the picture shifts from mysterious to alien. Maya royal art tells a consistent story about the elite that mainstream anthropology has largely glossed over. The rulers didn't look like their subjects. Royal portraits across dozens of city-states depict kings and queens as tall, slender, with dramatically elongated skulls. The commoner population was short and stocky. This wasn't artistic license. It was documentation of a visible physical difference between the ruling class and everyone else. The practice of cranial deformation, binding infants' heads to reshape the skull, is well attested across Mesoamerica and in Peru's Paracas culture. The conventional explanation is aesthetic. People elongated their skulls for beauty or status. But that raises a question nobody seems to ask. Why would an entire civilization decide that elongated skulls were beautiful? Cultural beauty standards don't emerge from nowhere. They imitate something. What if the commoners were reshaping their children's skulls to look like the natural skull shape of their rulers? The Star Child skull, discovered in Mexico in the 1930s and dating to approximately 900 CE, the exact twilight of classic Maya civilization, deepens the problem. Its cranial capacity exceeds modern human average by roughly 30%. The eye sockets are shallow and unusually shaped. The optic nerves exit at a different angle than in any known human population. The bone is extraordinarily thin, yet harder than normal, containing anomalous fiber-like structures in its matrix. DNA analysis conducted by researcher Lloyd Pye found that mitochondrial DNA, inherited from the mother, was human. But segments of the nuclear DNA, inherited from the father, matched no known primate species on Earth. Combine this with the Maya elite's obsession with bloodletting, the ritual piercing of tongues, ears, and genitals to offer blood to the gods. Scholars call it religious sacrifice. But what if it was something more functional? Genetic maintenance, biological sampling, energy harvesting for technology we haven't identified. The elite weren't just culturally different from the commoners. They appear to have been biologically different, possibly a hybrid species. And when they left, they took their bloodline with them, leaving behind a population that had lost its architects, its astronomers, its geneticists, and had no idea how to maintain the civilization those beings had built. The texts describe a departure. The tomb depicts a machine. The biology suggests a different species. But there's one final piece of evidence, and it comes from the last place you'd expect. In 2017, the CIA declassified millions of pages of previously secret documents, including transcripts from Project Stargate, the U.S. military's Cold War program that used remote viewers, individuals allegedly capable of perceiving distant locations through psychic means for intelligence gathering. One document stands out. File number CIA-RDP-96-0078-R0019-0076-0001-9, dated May 22, 1984. A remote viewer, believed to be Joseph McMoneagle, the Army's top psychic intelligence asset, was handed a sealed envelope containing coordinates. He was told nothing about the target. Standard blind protocol. He opened the envelope. The coordinates were 40.89 degrees north, 9.55 degrees west. Not on Earth. On Mars, the Cydonia Mensae region. Time frame, 1 million years BCE. What McMoneagle described, with no knowledge of where or when he was looking, was this. Massive pyramid-shaped structures in a geological depression, tall, obelisk-like monuments, an environmental catastrophe in progress, choking red dust, extreme heat, a dying world, and inhabitants, tall, thin beings sheltering in the crumbling structures. They wore unusual garments, and they were waiting for transport, a large metallic vessel. They were evacuating. When asked where they were going, the viewer said they were seeking a place with abundant vegetation and different storms. Read that again. Tall, thin beings, pyramidal architecture, an evacuation from a dying planet, destination, a lush, tropical world. Now lay that next to the Maya record. Royal art depicting tall, thin rulers, pyramids aligned to the stars. The Popol Vuh describing beings who came from the sky, the Chilam Balam recording their departure, a sarcophagus that looks like a spacecraft. A CIA psychic in a windowless room in Virginia in 1984, with no knowledge of his target, described the same beings, the same architecture, and the same journey that the Popol Vuh described 3,000 years ago. 5 evidence streams, ancient creation texts, prophetic departure records, an impossible sarcophagus, anomalous biology, a classified intelligence transcript. They span 3,000 years, 2 planets, and multiple continents. They were produced by people and institutions with no connection to each other: Maya priests, Austrian explorers, Mexican archaeologists, American military psychics. And they all converge on the same point. Here is the hypothesis stated plainly. The Maya elite were not entirely human. They were the descendants, or the direct representatives, of a civilization that fled a dying world. Whether that world was Mars or somewhere farther, they arrived on Earth carrying advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, genetics, and engineering. They established outposts in the jungles of Mesoamerica, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and built pyramids that mirrored the architecture of their home world, aligned to the stars they came from. They created or hybridized a ruling class to govern the indigenous population. They encoded their technology into stone because stone outlasts metal, outlasts paper, outlasts memory. And when the time came, by schedule, by signal, or by necessity, they executed a planned departure, the Exodus Protocol. The collapse was an evacuation. The pyramids were beacons. The long count calendar was a countdown. And the catastrophic fire from the sky, recorded in the Chilam Balam, that was a launch. The people left behind lost everything, not because of drought, but because the operators walked away from the machine. They performed blood rituals with increasing desperation, trying to summon back the beings who had given them civilization. They calculated return dates with astronomical precision. They waited. Some of them are still waiting. And if a remote viewer in 1984 could perceive the departure from Mars 1,000,000 years ago, the question that should keep you awake tonight is this: could they also see where the Maya went next? The Maya didn't leave us with silence. They left us with evidence, carved into limestone, encoded in jaguar priest prophecies, sealed inside a king's tomb, and scattered across declassified intelligence files that most people have never read. The question was never whether they disappeared. The question is whether we're willing to read what they wrote, not as mythology, not as metaphor, but as testimony. Somewhere in the jungles of Guatemala, pyramids still stand aligned to stars we're only now learning to reach. And somewhere in those stones, there may be coordinates we haven't decoded yet. History, as we know it, may be only the top layer, dust covering a truth so large that we built entire academic disciplines to avoid looking at it. But the evidence doesn't care about our comfort. It simply waits, like the Maya themselves, for someone willing to follow it all the way to the end. Which piece of evidence do you find hardest to explain? The ancient texts, Pakal's tomb, the biological anomalies, or the CIA document? Tell me in the comments. And if this investigation opened a door you didn't expect, share it with someone who's ready to walk through.